Hello and welcome to the Grumpy Fella channel. In today's episode I'm going to be talking about a young man called Graham Frederick Young. Born on the 7th of September 1947, he was best known as the Teacup poisoner and later the St Albans poisoner. He was an English serial killer who used poison to kill his victims. Obsessed with poisons from an early age, Young began poisoning relatives and school friends by lacing their food and drink with thallium and antimony. He was caught when his school teacher became concerned about his interest in poisons and contacted the police. In 1962, at the age of 14, Young was charged with administering poison to his father, sister and school friend, and detained at Broadmoor Hospital. Young would later claim responsibility for the death of his stepmother, although he was never charged with this crime. The presiding judge stipulated that Young should not be released without the Home Secretary's authorization for 15 years. Young was born in Neasden in Middlesex on the 7th of September 1947 to Frederick and Molly Young. He had an older sister, Winifred. Molly sadly died of TB when Graham was 14 weeks old. He was sent by his father to live with an uncle and aunt, while his sister went to live with their grandparents. Several years later, though, Frederick Young remarried to another woman named Molly, and the family were reunited. Graham was fascinated from an early age by poisons and their effects. He read extensively about Adolf Hitler, Nazi Germany, and William Palmer, the Victorian poisoner. In 1959, Young passed his 11 plus and went to grammar school. He also started to read books on advanced toxicology. Now this man was clearly educated and had reached a level of intelligence to understand science and poisons. So whilst he might not have been or might not have had the best upbringing, it didn't seem to hamper him. In 1961, Young acquired antimony from a local chemist. His knowledge of chemistry and poisons convinced the chemist that he was older than he appeared. He signed the poisons register in the name of M.E. Evans. He began poisoning his stepmother, father and sister. Beginning in February, Molly Young suffered vomiting, diarrhea and excruciating stomach pain, which she initially dismissed as bilious attacks. Before long, his father was also suffering with similar stomach cramps, debilitating him for days at a time. Then Young's sister was violently ill on a couple of occasions that summer. Shortly afterwards, Young himself was violently sick at home. It even seems as if a mystery bug had spread among their household. A couple of Young's school friends had also been off school ill a couple of times with similar painful symptoms. In November 1961, Winifred Young was served a cup of tea by her brother one morning, but found its taste so sour she took only one mouthful before she threw it away. While on the train to work an hour later, she began to hallucinate, had to be helped out to the station, and was eventually taken to hospital, where doctors came to the conclusion that she had somehow been exposed to the poison deadly nightshade. Fred Young confronted his son, but Graham blamed Winifred, whom he claimed had been using the family's teacups to mix shampoo. Unconvinced, Fred searched Graham's room, but found nothing incriminating. Nevertheless, he warned his son to be more careful in future when messing about with these bloody chemicals. On Easter, Saturday the 21st of April 1962, Molly Young died. Her death was attributed to a prolapsed cervical disc, which was believed to have resulted from a road accident. Much later, Young told police that he'd poisoned her with a lethal dose of thallium. At her wake, Young poisoned a male relative after lacing a jar of mustard pickle with antimony. Shortly afterwards, his father became seriously ill, and he was taken to hospital where he was told that he was suffering from antimony poison, and one more dose would have killed him. Young's aunt, who knew of his fascination with chemistry and poisons, became suspicious, as did his science teacher, Mr. Hughes, who discovered several bottles of poison in Young's desk and spoke to the school's headmaster about his concerns. They arranged for Young to be interviewed by a psychiatrist posing as a careers advisor, who contacted the police after Young revealed his extensive knowledge of poisons and toxicology. Young was arrested on the 23rd of May 1962 after returning home from school. Vials of thallium and antimony were found in his possession. When questioned by police, he confessed to poisoning his father, stepmother, sister, and school friend Chris Williams. Psychiatrist Dr. Chris Fish testified that Young was a psychopathic disorder rather than a mental illness, and had failed to develop a moral sense. He felt it was extremely likely that Young would re-offend, and recounted a conversation in which Young said, "I am missing my antimony. I miss the power it gives me." Fish recommended that Young be detained at Broadmoor Hospital, an institution for patients with mental disorders who have committed similar offences. Dr. Donald Blair, another psychiatrist, concurred with Fish's viewpoint, and Young pleaded guilty to 3 charges of poisoning his father, sister, and Chris Williams, and was convicted of malicious administration of a noxious thing to inflict GBH, or grievous bodily harm. He was not charged for murdering his stepmother, as her autopsy report did not list poison as the cause of death. The judge, Justice Melford Stevenson, ruled that Young was to be detained under Section 60 of the Mental Health Act in Broadmoor Hospital. Furthermore, he was not to be released for 15 years without the approval of the Home Secretary. At 14, Young was among Broadmoor's youngest ever inmates. During his time at Broadmoor, there was a number of poisoning incidents. Soon after his arrival, John Berridge, a fellow inmate, died of cyanide poisoning. Young was suspected by some staff and inmates, not least because he enjoyed explaining in detail how cyanide could be extracted from laurel leaves. The grounds around Broadmoor were covered with laurel bushes. However, Young's involvement was never proven, and the death was officially ruled a suicide. Later, Harpic was found in a nurse's coffee, and the contents of a missing packet of sugar soap were discovered in a tea urn. He continued to read medical and toxicology textbooks obtained from Broadmoor's library. He also continued his interest in Nazism, reading William Shirer's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich and Lord Russell's The Scourge of the Swastika. At one point he grew a toothbrush moustache and took to mimicking the speeches of Hitler and listening to composer Richard Wagner, who is one of Hitler's idols. Young first applied for release from Broadmoor in 1965. His father and his sister attended the tribunal and stated that if Young was released, none of his relatives would be willing to house him. Fred Young also told the hearing that his son should never be released. Young's application was rejected. In June 1970, after Young had spent nearly 8 years in Broadmoor, Edgar Unwin, the prison psychiatrist, wrote to the secretary, or the Home Secretary, to recommend his release, announcing that Young, is no longer obsessed with poisons, violence, or mischief, and he is no longer a danger to others. However, Young remarked to a Broadmoor nurse, "When I get out, I'm going to kill one person for every year I've spent in this place." After his release from Broadmoor in February 1971, Young initially stayed with his sister Winifred and her husband in Hemel Hempstead. Within weeks he had resumed his interest in poisons. An attempt to acquire poison from John Bell and Croydon in Wigmore Street was unsuccessful, as the chemist refused to sell them without written authorization. Young duly returned with the required authorization on Bedford College headed notepaper, and was sold 25 grams of antimony potassium tartrate. He told the chemist he needed it for a quantitative analysis. He later returned to the same chemist to purchase 25 grams of thallium. Poisoning of Trevor Sparks. Young attended a storekeeping training course in Slough and stayed at a hostel in nearby Chippenham. He befriended 34-year-old Trevor Sparks, another resident of the hostel, and the two occasionally visited the pub together or shared a bottle of wine in Sparks' room. Young would later confess to poisoning Sparks with antimony sodium tartrate. On the night of February the 10th, Sparks was violently sick, had diarrhea, pins and needles in his legs, and pains in his testicles. Earlier in the evening, he'd accepted a glass of water from Young. Sparks' symptoms returned periodically over the following months. He felt so ill during a football match that he had to leave the pitch after a few minutes. Specialists were unable to pinpoint the cause, variously diagnosing it as a kidney infection, bowel infection, urinary tract infection, or a stomach infection. Sparks left Slough in April 1971. The Bovington Bug. Young secured a job as an assistant storekeeper at John Hadland Laboratories in Bovington, Hertfordshire, near his sister's home in Hemel Hempstead. The company manufactured thallium bromide iodide infrared laser lenses, which were used in military equipment. However, no thallium was stored on site, and Young obtained his supplies of the poison from a London chemist. On his application, Young stated that he'd studied chemistry and toxicology. He explained that his lack of employment history was because he had suffered a nervous breakdown following the death of his mother in a car accident. His employers received references as part of Young's rehabilitation from Broadmoor, but were not informed of his past as a convicted poisoner. Young's probation officer never visited Young's home or place of work. Young left Slough and rented a room in Maynard Road, Hemel Hempstead, at £4 a week. His new colleagues found him unpredictable. He could be surly and kept to himself, but on other days he was more cheery. During breaks he usually sat alone reading, invariably a book on his favourite subjects: war, chemistry, Nazi Germany, or famous murderers. He was not talkative unless one of his favourite topics was being discussed. Young's duties at Hadland included collecting drinks from the tea trolley in the corridor and bringing them to the storeroom. Each employee had their own mug, which made it easier for him to target specific individuals for poisoning. Soon after Young's arrival at Hadland, he started poisoning his co-workers, mostly focusing on his intermediate colleagues in the storerooms. His modus operandi was to slip poison, usually antimony or thallium, into their tea or coffee. Victims would fall ill with symptoms that included vomiting, stomach pains, nausea, and diarrhea. Initially, the mysterious illness was assumed to be a virus and was nicknamed the Bovington bug. Other explanations put forward were contamination of the local water supply and radioactivity from a disused airfield from nearby. The murder of Bob Eagle. 59-year-old Bob Eagle was a storeroom manager at Hadland and Young's immediate superior. Eagle was a Dunkirk veteran and Young a Second World War enthusiast. Often asked about his wartime experiences, Young began poisoning Eagle in June, weeks after his arrival at the company. Eagle had several days off work with diarrhea and severe stomach pains. His health improved after a week-long holiday, but on his return, Young put a lethal dose of thallium in his afternoon tea. Eagle's condition deteriorated rapidly from this point. He complained of intense back pain and numbness in his fingers and feet. He was transferred to intensive care unit at St Albans City Hospital, where paralysis set in. Young showed a strong concern for Eagle, repeatedly contacting the hospital for updates on his progress. Eagle finally died on the 7th of July 1971. A post-mortem attributed Eagle's death to a rare form of polyneuritis, known as Guillain-Barré syndrome. Young was chosen to accompany Managing Director Godfrey Foster to Eagle's funeral, as a representative of the department Eagle managed. Foster recalled Young remarking how sad it was that Bob would come through the terrors of Dunkirk, only to fall victim to some strange virus. Poisoning of Ron Howard and Diana Smart. During Eagle's absences, Young targeted Eagle's assistant Ron Hewitt, poisoning his tea with antimony. Hewitt was already accepted a job at another company and was working his notice. Young was specifically hired as his replacement. After leaving the company, he suffered no further symptoms. As a result of Eagle's death and Hewitt's departure, Young was promoted to head storeman for a probationary period. For the next few months, his poisonings were limited to small doses of antimony on his co-worker Diana Smart's tea, usually when she'd annoyed him. Young wrote in his diary, "Di irritated me yesterday, so I packed her off with an attack of sickness. I only gave her something to shake her up. I now regret that I didn't give her a larger dose, capable of laying her up for a few days." Poisoning of David Tilson and Jethro Batt. On the 8th of October 1971, Young put thallium acetate in David Tilson's tea. Tilson found the tea too sweet for his liking. Young had added sugar to disguise any unusual taste from the thallium, and therefore did not drink it all. Young administered a second dose of thallium a week later. Tilson was admitted to hospital with numb legs, breathing difficulties, and chest pains. His skin was so tender he could not endure the weight of the bedsheets, and all his hair fell out. Young had a backup plan, though, to visit Tilson in hospital and offer him a bottle of brandy laced with more thallium. Subsequently, Tilson recovered, though he was left permanently impotent by the poisoning. At the same time he was poisoning Tilson, Young also began poisoning another Hadland employee, Jethro Batt. Batt had become friendly with Young and would give him a ride home to Hemel Hempstead. Young admitted to administering 4 grams of thallium to Batt in 2 doses, enough to kill him. However, he found the coffee Young had made for him too strong did not drink it at all. Nevertheless, Batt was admitted to hospital with stomach and chest pains and his hair fell out. The thallium made him suicidal. Bats ultimately recovered, but like Tilson, he was also left impotent. Young apparently felt some remorse of poisoning Bat, writing in his diary, "I feel rather ashamed in my action in harming Jay." Murder of Fred Biggs. Fred Biggs was a 56-year-old local councillor and part-time employee at Hadlands. Young poisoned him with antimony, prompting the typical Bovington bug symptoms. Then on the 30th of October 1971, Young bought 3 doses of thallium acetate into Biggs's tea. By the following day, Biggs had developed chest pains and had trouble walking. Within days, he was admitted to Hemel Hempstead General Hospital, then transferred to the Whittington Hospital on North London, followed by the London National Hospital for the Nervous Diseases, now part of the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery. His central nervous system deteriorated to the point where he could not speak and had trouble breathing. His skin also began to peel off, and Young showed concern for Biggs's condition, continually telephoning Biggs's wife and the hospital directly to make inquiries. Biggs finally died on 19th of November 1971. The investigation and the rest. The management at Hadland became so concerned about the mysterious sickness that they initiated an investigation. Moreover, some of Young's co-workers began to have suspicions about him. Diana Smart noticed that he was never affected by the bug and suggested he might be a carrier of the virus. Philip Doggett informed the management of Young's unhealthy interest in poisons. The firm's medical officer, Dr. Ian Anderson, told staff he had ruled out heavy metal poisoning as a possible cause, which led to an argument with Young, who insisted that the symptoms displayed by the victims pointed to this diagnosis. Intrigued by the young storeman, who seemed to be very knowledgeable about medicine, Anderson sought out Young after the meeting and quizzed him further. He quickly discovered that Young had a deep knowledge of poisons and toxicology, which prompted John Hadland, the firm's owner, to contact the police. The investigating officers noticed that from the onset of the Bovington bug coincided with Young's arrival at the company. A police background check revealed Young's earlier poisoning convictions. Young was arrested at the home of his aunt and uncle in Sheerness in Kent on the 20th of November 1971. Nothing incriminating was found on his person. He denied any wrongdoing, but as he was being led away, his aunt heard him ask the officers, which one is it you're doing me for?" When his bed was searched, they discovered a large stash of bottles containing poisons, including 434 milligrams of thallium and 32.3 grams of antimony. The latter was 200 times a lethal dose. Other poisons in his possession included atropine, acetine, and digitalis. His lodgings were covered in swastikas and pictures of Hitler and other Nazis. Police also discovered a detailed diary that Young had kept, noting the doses he had administered, their effects, and whether he was going to allow each person to live or die. Upon further questioning by police, he admitted that the initials in the diary referred to his co-workers. F for Fred Biggs, D was David Tilson, and so on. He confessed to poisoning Eagle, Biggs, Bat, Tilson and Trevor Sparks, and said that he deliberately used different poisons in order to confuse doctors. He also boasted of having committed the perfect murder by killing his stepmother, Molly. He spent 20 minutes explaining to the officers the effects of thallium and how this affected the human body. When asked why he had poisoned people who were his friends and colleagues, Young responded, "I suppose I had ceased to see them as people. At least a part of me had. They were simply guinea pigs." The trial and prison. Young was charged with 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, 4 counts of administering poison with intent to injury, and 4 alternative counts of administering poison with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. He pleaded not guilty, which made it difficult to find a barrister willing to represent him, and the trial date had to be postponed several times. Eventually, Sir Arthur Irvine QC agreed to defend him. John Leonard QC led the prosecution for the Crown. The judge was Mr. Justice Evely, and the trial was held at St Albans Crown Court and started on the 19th of June 1972. Due to safeguards protecting defendants, the jury could not be told of Young's previous convictions for poisoning. Young retracted his earlier confession to the police, claiming he'd only made it in order to get some rest. Nevertheless, the evidence against him was strong. The prosecution called 75 witnesses to testify against him. Young himself was the only witness in his defence. Excerpts from Young's diary was read out in court. Young claimed the diary was a fantasy for a novel. Examination of Fred Biggs's internal organs found thallium in his intestines, kidneys, muscles, bones and brain tissue. The cremated remains of Bob Eagle, which had not been scattered yet, were also analysed and found to contain 9 milligrams of thallium. The latter was the first instance of cremated ashes being used as evidence in a murder conviction. On the 29th of June 1972, after 1 hour and 38 minutes of deliberation, the jury found Young guilty of 2 counts of murder for Bob Eagle and Fred Biggs, 2 counts of attempted murder for Jethro Batt and David Tilson, and 2 counts of administering poison with intent to injure for Diane Smart and Ronald Hewitt. He was found not guilty of administering poison to Trevor Sparks and Peter Buck, and was acquitted on all 4 counts of administering poison with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. Through his counsel, Young requested that he be sent to a conventional prison rather than return to Broadmoor. His request was granted, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment to be served at Her Majesty's Prison, Park Lane in Maghull, later changing to Ashworth Hospital. During his stay at Ashworth, he was removed from cells due to him being able to make poison out of 7 common household items with no antidote for it, so was moved regularly and cells searched. He would have regular visits from a medical director, and during these visits Young said to the medical director that he had seen on the medical journals that a trial drug from America would be beneficial to him. They looked into this and ordered a batch from America and got him a 2-week course. After the 2 weeks, another interview with Young was arranged, during which Young informed the medical director that it seemed to be working, but the effects wore off, and asked for another dose to be increased. This was done, and after a further 2 weeks, another review was arranged. And during this review, Young asked his solicitor to be notified, as Park Lane had been overdosing him. He was later transferred to Her Majesty's Prison, Parkhurst. While in prison, Young befriended Moors murderer Ian Brady, with whom he shared a fascination for Nazi Germany. Brady's 2001 book, The Gates of Janus, in which he discusses various serial killers, includes a chapter on Young. Brady wrote that Young was generally asexual, finding even the discussion of sexual matters not only uninteresting, but also distinctly distasteful. Power and death were his aphrodisiacs and raison d'etre. Elsewhere, Brady stated that it was difficult not to empathise with Graham Young. Young died in his cell at Parkhurst Prison on the evening of 1st of August 1990, 1 month before his 43rd birthday. The cause of death was listed as myocardial infarction at an inquest after a post-mortem. As Young had no history of heart disease, it had been speculated that he'd either committed suicide or was murdered by prisoners or prison staff who did not feel safe around him. And so there you have it, the case of Graham Frederick Young. I'd like to thank you for listening to the Grumpy Fella channel. Please feel free to like this video if you enjoyed this story, and make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss out on future cases. Goodbye for now, and stay safe.